I have the seed of a concept and I let it be planted inside me, and then I wait for it to grow. That's like the entirety of my process. Once the seed was planted, then my brain is thinking about what does it mean to be connected? What does it mean to be connected in 2020? What does it mean to be isolated in Switzerland in a tiny town? What does all of that mean? And if I take that feeling, that essence, and I manifest it in a piece of music, then there's going to be some nuance about that piece of music that when I focus on it is going to give me an idea for the physical manifestation of that concept as a design object. Then I started to think about how we see the natural formations that feel like, or they appear to be, reaching from the core of the earth up to the sky. And that's when I started looking at rock formations and seeing the connection to doing a project in the UK in the Giant's Causeway. It became clear to me that that in a way could come to represent a way of expressing the earth reaching to the sky, and the fact that this table was going to be rendered in wood. And that's when I started to ask the questions about where the wood was coming from. We realized that we could use...
It happens in all of your work. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like what catches your eye, what's inspiring to you, and how you bring that to the projects you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're one of the few people that gets to like witness that obsessiveness, as it's happening. But honestly, I think usually my goal is to, even though I'm obsessive about all of these minute details, the end goal is to make it so that nobody even thinks about that stuff, right? A lot of times when I think about how I want to design something, or the impact that a design should have, I think about how if you're not paying attention, you mindlessly walk past a beautiful rose that's growing on the side of the road, and you don't necessarily stop and analyze every single surface on it. But if you were to pick it and look at it, they would be able to see everything that's beautiful about it, right? And so I think from an empathetic standpoint as a designer, the goal isn't to necessarily beat people over the head with how intentional and how much I pay attention to every detail, insofar as it's to obsess about those details to the point that they disappear unless somebody's actually paying attention to it. When you mentioned like the surfacing of the arms of the chair and the frame and everything else, the main thing that I was thinking was that, nobody should have to pay attention to it until they have that aha moment where their body is touching it and they realize how smooth and beautiful and perfect the surface is. How perfectly it is unobtrusive to their muscles, which are flexible, bumping up against it, and then everything kind of forming in an organic and fluid way against each other, as opposed to having hard angles and things that, are not, as you could say, ergonomic from a surface standpoint. So the obsession between finding that the beauty visually and the beauty kind of when you touch it with different parts of your body, that's something that, it's my job to obsess over. And it's also my job to push back on the engineers when we have practical constraints that drive us in a direction where we might lose some of that. So, for me, it's about having the empathy for the end user, and also for the engineer that's trying to do their job, and for the marketing team that's trying to sell the object, and then figuring out how to get all of those things into the object,
Those are the elements, I think, from the marketing side of the business to just articulating design to an audience that, as you're saying, it's not necessarily at the forefront of how they go through life. I think you and I have shared our love for Salone and Milan, and there's definitely a sense that the Milanese people really understand how design affects their everyday life. From the, AirPod case that you flip around in your hand, no one's thinking that somebody spent months and months and months designing that radius so it would feel that way in your hand. They just appreciate like a beautiful stone you pick up on the beach. I feel the same way about the back of the chair, the geometry that you created, because what do you do with a cafe chair? You're grabbing the back and you're pulling it out. So how that feels in your hand, again, you might not stop and appreciate the design like you're saying, you just appreciate how it feels. And it's a part of the experience of engaging with your beautiful designs. I certainly appreciate that. And we try to take all those little tidbits and bring them through the marketing into the sales team so they can then talk to a client about why this is such an extraordinary piece. I'm sure interior designers on the call do the same thing when they're explaining to a client why they're setting up a space the way they are, why they're continuing a radius from this piece to that piece. So subliminally, it all works well together. So I really appreciate that about what you do and what you bring to the world. Do you have any, I know you're really into music, and music is really what feeds your soul right now. We've talked a little bit about with COVID and with business, work and design starts out being this fun.
The wood that was considered, for whatever reason, effective or unusable. So what does it mean if we're constructing this base out of a bunch of different elements that are shaped to fit together, that are constructed of discarded materials? And that's where I started to see the parallel between wood that we were using, story that I was beginning to tell, and the situation that humanity had found itself in during this time period of the coronavirus. And then from the perspective of the creative, being me, using the table, you have this glossy, perfectly finished with brass elements and leather and everything that's so beautiful, being held up by the scrap pieces of wood, that when you look at it and you step back and look at it collectively, it makes for a beautifully composed whole. Before I start, I want to thank my fellow speakers, and I've probably rewritten and rearranged the slides for my presentation so many times, and being with these fellow speakers has not only inspired me, but they've also given me quite a bit of support and given me the encouragement that I needed to have the courage to talk about what I'm going to talk about today. There was a point I started writing about the darkness, and I didn't stop until I had written my way out of it, essentially. And during that time, I came to a realization that my darkness came from
new monthly series on all things design. And for the month of October, we have a conversation with Knoll designer, Archibong. Is an industrial designer, creative director, artist, and musician who recently brought his sensibility, design acuity, and collective influences to Knoll for the Equo Cafe collection. In this edition of Design Perspectives, he'll be exploring his unique design process, where he draws inspiration, and how he aims to influence the world through his work. So this will be a conversation with Mindy Renasco from Knoll and Archibong. And before I turn it over to them, just a couple of thoughts. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the session. So please type your questions into the chat field. And we encourage you to ask your questions throughout the course of the conversation so that you don't forget them. But again, please type your questions in chat. We will answer those at the end of the conversation between Minnie and Minnie, and we also ask you to mute your microphones. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mindy and Innie. Welcome. And Mindy, you are on mute.
Great way to start, right?
Loud and clear. We can hear you now.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Innie, we have a global audience here today. So people all over the world looking to meet you, maybe some, learn more about you and hear what you have to say. I'm extremely excited today to have this opportunity to chat with you. We used to see each other more often, but with COVID and everything else, we don't get that opportunity anymore. I know you're just coming off a bout with COVID, so I really appreciate that you're being so generous with your time today. And I think a good way to ground the conversation is a little bit of your backstory. For those that don't know, I mean, you've been so widely published. I can't imagine anybody not knowing, but give us a little bit about, starting here in the States and where that's taken you.
Hello, everyone, and hi, Mindy. Good to see you again. So my backstory, without being long-winded, I'm from Pasadena, California, where I attended high school and also ended up at the Art Center College of Design to do my bachelor's in industrial design and environmental design. I've worked in architecture. I've had a stint, making beats. I've lived in Singapore working in architecture and working in industrial design at 8 Inc. And I did my master's here in Switzerland at the ECAL in Lausanne, master's in luxury. And since then, I've been living here in Neuchâtel, small, sleepy town, about 2 hours from every big city in Switzerland. And yeah, I guess I've worked with different companies ranging from Hermes to Knoll, obviously, and done some gallery work with Friedman Benda, exhibited in a few museums, and I don't know, in general, I just try to lead a creative life, and I've been lucky to have a lot of avenues for that. So that's the condensed version of my backstory.
The way you delivered it, though, it was like, I've done a little work for MS, I've done this, I've done that. It's so extraordinary. I mean, your journey has just been so extraordinary. I think especially some of the Murano glass work you've recently done. Can you talk a little bit about, you seem to start with a project like that by really embedding yourself with the craftsmen and learning how they develop these beautiful blown glass and then, design around that.
Living a life that wasn't in line with higher purpose, and that I wasn't living as if I believed the truth that I felt inside, that somehow I was a hero. I had, a very spiritual upbringing, and along with that, I, was very into fantasy books and things of that nature that, give you the inspiration and point toward the fact that there's a higher calling for all of us. And I developed what I call a personal mythology. For me, when I talk about a personal mythology, I'm talking about, an amalgamation of all of the stories and all of the influences and all the things that I've had that were indications that pointed me to a deeper dimension or a higher truth, or something that's beyond that I could tap into to really use the skills and the gifts that I was born with to benefit everyone and everything. So there came a point when I graduated from ECAL where, I wanted to present myself essentially to the world as a creative, and I needed to try to distill, all of these things that I'd come to believe into a project, and I call that project In the Secret Garden. It started with a metaphor, and the garden in fantasy literature and in different spiritual traditions represents a place of the unknown where anything can happen and the normal rules of this reality don't really apply. And for me, my secret garden is a layer that exists above reality where I can escape to and find the inspiration to create the things that I feel could somehow represent in themselves objects that are representations of this mythology. So when I started on the project, it wasn't the typical design process that I was used to. I went back to writing. So I tried to describe what this secret garden looks like. Fragments of our waking life, magnified and enlivened with the richness, the substance of dreams. Crystal flowers, frozen in bloom, dripping stalactites from the frosty marbled sky. In the garden, we find flat-headed fungi, top liquiline legs, precarious substance held by tension of surface alone. While soft billowing clouds of ground reveal an impish smile and winking eyes as they vanish, a camouflage of floral feline striping, dream or nightmare.
So much of how we use wood contributes to, the sustainability and the health of the planet. I'm a solitary worker, so I don't have a big studio. I work here at home. Once I have a brief or a concept beginning to form, I just kind of consume a lot of stuff related to that concept, whether it's books or music. I could grab some Quintessence. This one was really weird. Piano Overlord. I think that I listened to something from the weather report with almost everything I make until I have kind of a bank of inspiration and all the ideas are kind of floating in the same soup, and then eventually it crystallizes into a form or some kind of object in my head, and then I kind of turn it around and look at it from all angles until I understand it.
Do you start by the learning and then know where you can go with this? Tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah, I mean, well, with Murano in general, it's not necessarily, I don't see them as different projects. It's almost like an ongoing dialogue with the craftsmen over there over the past, I guess, 4 or 5 years. I had my introduction to glass blowing actually here in Switzerland through the ACAL with a glass blower here that I've worked with and I continue to work with for a lot of my gallery work. But when I had the opportunity to get to Murano, I discovered, a different way of working with glass that has been very inspiring and informative into the way that I work in general. One of the beautiful things about glass is that it's a material it's basically alive until the moment that it becomes frozen into the shape that you receive it as the customer, right? Or whoever is being presented with the art piece. So in that sense, this working with that material, it took me out of the typical kind of industrial design and architecture process where you figure everything out, you lock it down into a drawing, and then you proceed to manufacture, because everything is alive and moving and you have to kind of be in the flow and on the fly. So, I guess the really important thing about the process of glass is that it has informed the way that I work ever since I started working with glass. I think that, having studied in ICAL, one of the most important things about luxury for craftsmanship is that you have to learn how to communicate with craftsmen. You have to learn how to walk into a space, get a quick understanding of the material and what gives its defining element, and then use that to create your vision of something that's going to be impactful to people. So taking that perspective and starting with glass as a main material gave me a different perspective on how I design in general. So even coming back to the work done with Noel, I'm sure you probably remember from some of the meetings, I could fly out to Greenville and meet with you and the marketing team and the engineers and everybody that has their various inputs, and we could take a look at the prototype, and any of the inputs that come in, there's this feeling of getting information, synthesizing it, and reacting kind of in the fly, the same way that you have to react when you're working with molten glass. Because if we're trying to make something in the hot shop and things start going left and somebody gives me some information and we have to decide what to do, we have to figure it out like that. So I think that started to inform how I approach kind of all.
I think, the design process for me, in my position here, I've had the privilege of working, I call it creative adjacent, because I'm not the creative really in the room. It's always wonderful designers like you and our amazing team of engineers. So that iterative process, I think sometimes it can get a little thorny, and sometimes it can just, it's like the sand in the oyster. It creates a higher level of design than I think any of us ever thought we could achieve. So I personally really love that process. And I think in our working together, you really pushed our engineers for specific things you obsessed about in the design. And I think they pushed you also, saying, we're trying to achieve a level of strength here that we need, where this will go in not only the contract market, but the residential market. And you of course, would push back and say, that's great, but it still has to be beautiful. All of that is just such a great, wonderful process to be able to be around and have input into. And I want to talk a little bit about that. When I talk about the things you're obsessed with, anybody who's on the call who knows the Equo Cafe collection, there were very specific things. If you look at the beautiful ribbon-like arch that's on the back of the chair, it was something that Eni really obsessed about, making that as thin as possible and ribbon-like. And Eni, when you think of those types of things that I think designers see the world in a certain way, you see the world differently than I kind of walk by and maybe miss some things. So I love when you share some of the ways that you look at things. And I think
I really wanted to give the feeling of flowers blooming from the snow of the winter. So with the marble canopy and working with a glass craftsman, creating something that would be vibrant and alive and would represent the hope that no matter how deep or dark or long the winter is, there's always hope. There's always spring right around the corner. Galilee Coffee Table drew its inspiration from my childhood in the church. For me, growing up, Jesus was like a superhero. And, there was all of the feats in the parables, and one that stood out is Jesus walking on the water. But for me, what stood out wasn't the miracle of Jesus walking on water. It was actually that moment where he grabbed his disciple Peter and he told him to join him. And for a split second, Peter was walking on water with Jesus until he lost his faith and he looked down and he sunk. For me, this is a reminder that to always believe in the power of oneself, and that belief in self is actually a belief in the higher power, and to take on the mantle of being a hero and fulfilling your purpose. Next was the Orion side table. This comes from my fascination with Greek mythology. I started studying Latin when I was about 12 and got heavily into mythology. And one of the characters that stood out for me was the character of Orion, who was a demigod. He had the power to walk on water, and he was notoriously handsome, but he had the fatal flaw of being consumed by his ego. With the power to do so much greatness and do so many good things, instead he used it to selfishly feed his ego, and in the end left a trail of blood in his wake. So with this, I really wanted to maintain this idea of having, a tabletop with glass legs and the feeling of floating of a product that you wouldn't expect to exist on something liquid, but then also have the tint of the blood that he left behind streaming through the legs. After doing this project, it opened up something new inside me as a designer. The first time I really tried to make tangible a lot of the things that have been floating around inside of me, and a lot of the very spiritual background of what I do as a creator. And afterward, I was, with this new process, I went on to create a new kind of product in my life. This is the Om table, and this table is about serenity and peace that comes from still waters. And I call it Om because it's meant to be a physical mantra. These are the Del Sol floor lamps, and this was meant to capture the feeling, bliss that you have, of the sunset, and distill it and almost turn it into a liquid and imagine it dropping to the ground in front of you and being frozen there. The Erosion collection stands as a reminder that we are the marks of our history, and the marks of time make us, the beautiful creatures and objects that we are, and to never hide our scars. With the totem, this is a calendar for mindfulness, and this 1.4 meter sculpture is meant to be a daily indicator and reminder that we can walk with mindfulness throughout the day, because you can take one of the stones out of this sculpture and meditate on it in the morning and put the power into it that you want to, and carry it with you throughout the day as a reminder of what you meditated on in the morning. I put the intention into it, and the fact that I'm here to be able to talk about it maybe might give somebody an inspiration to try to put the same amount of spiritual effort into the products that they create. And in the end, my goal is to inspire people to believe in themselves as heroes as well, because I think that we are all born heroes. Thank you.
When I was at the conservatoire and I learned more about the carriages and the horses and where Hermes got its beginning, it struck me that they were on the cutting edge of technology, even high technology. And to a lot of people, that approach to making harnesses and the hardware that came out of it, probably the shapes appeared to be somewhat futuristic. This idea of androgyny is something that I really wanted to bring into the watch. Have something that is curvaceous and beautiful, but then also something that is succinct and direct and to the point and doesn't need to be dainty or necessarily covered with diamonds in order to speak to a woman's feminine power.
And really kind of creative passion, and then the business part gets into it. So talk a little bit about balancing life and business. I know that's a little bit of a challenge that you're trying to solve even for yourself right now. And then how music is playing into your life and how that feeds your soul in a creative way also.
I think that, I mean, so it's funny, the music and the design kind of like took up a main portion of my life at the same time. For me, as far as like creative expression, once I decided to follow a creative path, then my life became a creative life. So the music blends into the design and the design blends into the music. And a lot of times music is what kind of keeps me sane through the fact that I've made a business out of my design, because the music doesn't have a business aspect attached to it, at least yet, right? So I think that, you know, from a creative perspective, I think that as a designer, as an independent designer, as a designer that, you know, runs a studio that, you know, as basically as a designer that doesn't have a job, there's a lot of pressure, to perform, a lot of pressure to talk about what I do, a lot of pressure to monetize, you know, my creativity in order to live. And you know, I don't think that we talk about it very much, because usually, you know, the people that could be talking about it are dealing with it and trying to figure out how to manage it. But it can be personally something that can be quite a challenge. You know, I don't think that we have very much conversation about like the need to protect your mental health when managing your time and your efforts. We come from, you know, an industry where our education and our work kind of culture is all about pulling those all-nighters, doing whatever it takes to get it done. And don't get me wrong, like that has helped me to get to where I am, having that mentality, right? But when it starts actually working, that's when you realize, you know, like, wait a second, I've got to figure out how to balance this. You know, I've been fortunate to have the music as a balancing element in that, because you know, you don't anticipate it, but you do end up going through phases of not necessarily creative block, but just being tired of being creative, right? And whenever I'm feeling that, the music, it really quickly snaps me right back into it, because you know, the ideas come and they come right back. And I think there's also like generationally, or maybe it's not a generational thing, because I'm sure it was probably similar in previous generations, but for me, like, you know, I was born in the early 80s. So like by the time I was getting into adolescence and music and hip hop was all around me, you know, it's a participatory thing. So I've been expressing myself creatively, you know, kind of for as long as I can remember from that standpoint. So when I start,
the stirrup for me became a logical starting point. I started to develop the idea of bringing in very technical hardware to hold the strap, but also taking the crown from the side of the watch to the bottom of the watch. It's about the way that the light plays on the surfaces and about how that gives the sense of shape while giving a sense of freedom and fluidity. My approach to the dial was to create something that was quite open and free. If you look closely, the numbers are not all the same size, and they get smaller in ascending order to give a sense of perspective, a sense of speed, you know, the type of speed that you see when you're going fast in a boat, or when you're flying on a jet. You know, you have this focus. To me, when it comes to time, it's not so much about precision, it's more so about how you enjoy time. My philosophy on time is just, I guess, a lot more free.